Chapter 2 Resilience Conference. Opening Ceremonies. Enrique Zavala. Lead Architect. Zavala Architectural Associates. Owner of the Institute. Significant events like this one always made him nervous. Even a renowned public speaker can come down with a terrible case of stage fright. Enrique was used to this by now, since his architectural firm had done a lot of public buildings and grand openings. This was the most significant appearance Enrique had to make to date. From his office overlooking the loggia, between the two wings of the lodge, Enrique could see a few hundred people gathered and more arriving every minute. As the Institute's founder, Enrique had to give the opening speech and set the tone for the week-long conference. Just 5 years ago, this had been undeveloped wilderness. And now they were hosting one of the largest conferences of the year. Enrique's team had reached out to a few different foundations and fellow conferences to bring in expert speakers and researchers. By the end of the evening, they would know if they had pulled it off or crashed and burned. Especially exciting was the technology they had up and running for the event's participants. His brother James had been working long hours to fix the bugs, and Cleo had been testing the invisible tagging compounds. The results were stunning. From his suite overlooking the central atrium, his optical unit was displaying an intricate breakdown of statistics on the crowd below. Each participant was given a keepsake bracelet made of a natural material with their conference pass as a wooden plaque in the middle. They did not hide the fact that they would keep track of the attendees. It was one of the many interactive displays of current research. However, they didn't know that the tracker was not on the wooden plaque. The fabric had a compound soaked into it, and within 10 minutes of being worn would tattoo the skin with invisible ink. That stayed on for about a week. The different signatures allowed them to track who had a one-day ticket versus a week-long, and who was a resident and who was a visitor. Kevin, the head of security, had required this because of the risk of letting this many people onto the property. This way, they could keep track of everyone and get alerted when someone was out of bounds. The backup measure was their new face recognition system. You can never be too cautious. As Enrique turned back to his lunch guests, their names popped up. The gathering was in his executive boardroom. This was an exclusive meal for the sponsors and big-name attendees to the conference. A few were business associates, a couple of country leaders, and even a few celebrities. Heading over to a group of his mother's society friends who had been integral to the success of EXT Architectural. I must take my leave now. Thank you all for joining us for this event. If you need anything, my personal staff is at your beck and call. Gesturing to Roger, his senior associate in charge of global relations, to take over as host of the gathering. Roger was a master of working the room and already knew each visitor's favorite drinks or fresh fruit and had their penthouse suites stocked. As Enrique walked out saying goodbye and making his way to the elevators, he was reminded how much receptions like that one chafe at him. However, he was the face of the Institute, so there was no getting around it. His mother's formal parties and politically angling consumed his childhood. Enrique knew how to navigate the waters and the importance of friends in high places. However, Enrique was so thankful for Roger and his competent staff that would be doing most of the wining and dining of the elite visitors. His father was a rare exception in his family. Donnex had made sure Enrique and his brother appreciated a hard day's work and stayed humble. He was an electrical engineer and traveled a lot, so he made sure to bring his sons along to third world countries. They would help him build homes and bring water purification systems, as well as off-the-grid energy generation to remote villages. From his father, Enrique learned his love of architecture and a sense of purpose. As a young adult, Enrique learned to bridge the two worlds of his long-separated parents with ease. In hindsight, it was what made him uniquely suited for building up the Institute. Come to think of it, Enrique would have to make sure to keep both of his parents civil during the week's events. They were like oil and a match. Enrique made a note to remind his brother about this. Enrique exited the elevators to the main floor and headed towards the stage that had been set up in the loggia with the mountain as the backdrop. Working the crowd on his way up, Enrique could feel the tension building. Matt Dunn, head carpenter, owner of Dunn Construction, Inc. Wearing a suit made Matt itch, even this one made of the most exquisite textiles and tailored to fit. He'd prefer to wear his cotton jeans and cut-off shirt, but in this crowd, it would call unwanted attention to him. Matt was shocked by the size of the crowd when he entered the main hall. It was jam-packed. Mariah spotted him immediately and made a point to head over. She knew, left unattended, he would avoid the spotlight and head for the open bar. Damn, she was stunning tonight. Had to give her that. She was beautiful on an average day, but tonight, damn, she was distracting. Hey, gorgeous, came out of his mouth before his brain could catch up. Mariah's face lit up and she smirked at him and slowly turned so Matt could appreciate the low-cut back. She knew how to push his buttons. All other thoughts had left his head. Are you ready to stand on stage and look good? She asked, alluding to an inside joke they had. Matt always joked that with all the intellectuals in the community, his job was pure brawn and looks. Actually, I had a crucial date with the newest batch of IPAs they just released. Matt jokingly started towards the bar. Looping her arm in his, she steered him towards the stage. That can wait. We are commencing in a few minutes, and your presence is required on stage. Crap. He knew they had cooked something up, but he was really hoping to keep it low-key. Just as they started up towards the stage, he could see Kate, Enrique, Rebecca, James, and Cleo all converging on it as well. Here we go. Man, the look some of the guys were giving Mariah made him want to punch someone. Or maybe it was the prospect of having to stand on stage in front of a few hundred people. Mariah squeezed his arm and pulled him closer to her, as if sensing he was about to break for the hills. Kate Boone, Civil Engineering, B Inc. Watching Mariah and Matt cut through the crowd made her smile. They made such a cute couple. Kate really hoped he'd come to his senses soon and make things official. Matt tried hard to hide it, but was entirely in love with Mariah. A self-proclaimed bachelor, it would have ruined his cover to settle down. What a shame. He was like her adopted brother, and she loved to give him a hard time. Seeing him in a tux was more than Kate could resist. Hey, Matt, you look just adorable. They didn't let you wear your worn-out jeans? He squinted his eyes at Kate in mock frustration, with a slight smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. Nah, although I did order a camo tie, somehow it got lost in the mail. He mock glared at Mariah, who just shrugged as if she had no idea what we were talking about. As if she had no idea what they were talking about. Kate looked over the crowd for Carl. Not hard to miss her husband. He was towering over the crowd and lingering towards the back. His massive hand was dwarfing a pint glass and making the amber liquid disappear into his full black beard. Matt noticed and grumbled. That lucky bastard getting a head start on the beer. They commonly tried to drink each other under the table and rarely ever succeeded. Men. Although, when they got to playing music together, it was just awe-inspiring. Too bad they refused to play for this event. Mariah McTavish, landscape architect, Terra Alta Associates. Mission accomplished. Mariah had successfully dragged Matt, kicking and screaming, to the stage. Now he couldn't leave without making a scene, so he was stuck. Mariah walked over to Enrique's side. He was in his element. Standing tall in his Italian suit, he could have been on the cover of GQ. "Are you ready to make history?" Mariah asked, looking out over the crowd from where they were standing in the wings. "Of course, with you at my side, we can do anything." He turned to her. The expression in his eyes was red hot. He leaned in close, tracing a finger down Mariah's back to where her dress stopped. "Will you be free later?" he murmured in her ear. She felt like she had been electrocuted. He probably just meant a debriefing of the opening ceremony, or other work-related things. Deep breaths. Then Mariah noticed Kate giving her a not-so-subtle thumbs up. Yikes! It was her job to introduce him, and Mariah had overlooked the cue. Walking across stage, she reached the podium. Thousands of people looking up at her from inside and outside in the plaza. Mariah smiled and waved, acknowledging those she knew. As the noise died down, Mariah started her prepared speech. "Honored guests, thank you for joining us to celebrate the grand opening of the Institute and our first annual conference. We are honored to host such a great gathering of minds and look forward to the next week's speakers. As the owner of Terra Alta Landscape Architecture, it has been an honor and a privilege to work with such a gifted team of visionaries to create what you see here. Without a further ado, let me introduce the man that made it happen, Enrique Zavala." Mariah stepped aside and looked towards Enrique. He strode out onto the stage like a king, confident and powerful. He gave her a kiss on the cheek and turned to embrace the crowd. He basked in the moment, smiling warmly as the crowd applauded. After a few moments, he raised both hands, and a hush fell over the crowd. His face became serious. You could feel the anticipation of the crowd. "As many of you know, this here, the Institute, has been my life's work. This wouldn't have been possible without these key contributors." He gestured to the wings, signaling Kate, Matt, Rebecca, and a few others to come out and join Mariah on stage behind them. "Thanks to this incredible team, they made it a reality. Our mission is to bring together the best minds in the world. Only then will they be able to solve the biggest challenges that face our world today: hunger, disease, poverty." He paused, letting the echo of his voice fade to silence. The crowd was hanging on his every word. Conferences like these are the first step to making knowledge accessible to all. By the end of this week, we will have heard from a wide range of experts. We challenge each of you to take what you learn here and go make an impact on the world. A loud round of applause went up, and he graciously soaked it in. "Thank you." He smiled and waited for the room to quiet down. "Before we let you go enjoy the incredible food prepared by Rebecca's army of chefs, I have a special thank you." He motioned Matt forward. Standing side by side, Mariah admired both from the edge of the stage. Enrique's dark hair and mocha skin contrasted with Matt's fair hair and twinkling blue eyes. She always marveled at how those two were so different and yet such close friends. Matt was the unstoppable force that built everything you're experiencing today. Enrique gestured at the surrounding building. His direction and hands-on leadership brought this project in on time and under budget. Two things you never expect to hear on a construction project. He paused as laughter politely filled the room. Without him, this would have just been a grand idea and an impressive 3D rendering. Applause and cheers erupted from the crowd. Matt stepped over to the microphone. He looked uncomfortable, but sounded strong. Thanks, y'all. Now let's get this party started. He grinned and made an over-exaggerated bow to Enrique before walking back to stand next to Mariah. She laughed hard and gave him a big hug. He took the opportunity to pick her up. Her resulting inhale of breath made his evening. As my good friend says, let this celebration begin. Enrique dismissed the crowd, and servers started through with trays of hors d'oeuvres. On to the gala. Enrique Zavala, lead architect. With the ceremony over, Enrique felt an incredible weight lifted. Enrique would make the rounds quickly and head home as soon as politely possible. He made sure to listen and talk with a few guests he had invited personally, keeping Mariah in the corner of his eye the whole time. She was in her element. Enrique felt a wave of jealousy as he noticed a gentleman from the Academy of Tokyo making her laugh. Enrique could not ask for a better partner in business, and hoped she would let him take it a little bit further than that. She was influential in a humble and honest way. People were just drawn to Mariah. She always could read what they needed. Where Enrique was aloof, she was approachable. And she could hold her own in a debate, testing even his patience sometimes, but always bringing the projects up to the next level. At that same moment, Enrique noticed his mother, clustered in a group with the heads of 5 leading corporations in the US. He switched gears and headed over to do his job and work the angles presented. She was only here for the publicity and optics. She had originally complained about having to ride the commoner's trolley. The after party. Matt Dunn, head carpenter. Thank goodness that was over, Matt thought to himself. Damn that Enrique for blindsiding him like that. Time for a well-deserved drink. Already a group of individuals was crowded around, and he was trading stories and laughing. No better way to make friends than share a brew and swap some jokes. Of course, underneath his laid-back party guy persona, he was taking in everything. The whole event was being monitored, but there is only so much technology can do. Carl was standing to his right, their go-to scouting arrangement. Old habits died hard, especially when they saved your ass more than once in combat zones. Carl took over telling the story of the first time Matt had learned to ride. They'd grown up in Texas together, but he never forgot to bring up the story. He was such a cocky little shit that he thought all he had to do was jump on and go. Carl winked at his captive audience. We catch the wildest little gray filly. Took us hours to get her roped. Then he hopped on, and I think, this is not a good idea. Just as we start out of the gate, this filly bolts right out from under him. He lands on his ass in a ditch, covered in mud, the horse long gone. Matt chuckled, remembering his confusion. One second he was on top of a horse, next he was looking up at Carl on his. Just at that moment, Kate walked up and planted a kiss on Carl's cheek. Don't believe a thing he says. His tails are just as tall as he is. She smiled at the group and introduced herself. It always amazed him how she turned on her southern charm with newcomers. That sweet drawl and the flowing blonde hair made her the picture of a southern belle. Matt still doesn't know how a Neanderthal like Carl caught such an incredible woman. Of course, Mariah was a stunner too. He looked out and saw her mingling. Kate Boone. Matt and Carl had found their tribe already. Gathered around the taps, the 2 ex-special ops guys had the most laid-back attitudes. Kate could tell Carl had just told the horse story. It was one of his favorites, and Matt had that "aw shucks" look he gave right after the punchline. It was incredible to be home. This was going to be a major conference, and Kate hoped they would get a few more recruits out of it. She had a handful of hopeful prospects she had invited. They needed to expand their on-property scientific division, particularly in biologicals. Even though they had a surgeon and a psychologist, they needed someone to head the team to research genetics and pathogens in contained environments. Kate spotted Cleo talking to their top pick, Racken, a member of the Center for Disease Control. She made a mental note to see what her take was on him. Racken, a round and jovial man with his thick Afrikaans accent, added a melody to his presentations. His expertise was airborne contagions and their spread. He was going to be giving a talk on his work with the latest outbreak of the flu and genetically engineered pathogens. His team had been on the front lines of the Russia plague. They had reverse engineered a vaccine, but not before whole towns were wiped off the face of the earth. Kate shivered. That was her worst nightmare. The Institute was so unprepared for a quarantine situation here. With all the tensions rising globally, the US had a huge target on its back. Their president had made enemies of their allied nations. Shaking off the doom and gloom that had overtaken her, Kate sipped some of her Meadowcroft Pinot Noir and listened to Matt and Carl's stories.